Hello. Oh, sorry, that's not my channel. Welcome to Keeping Up with Cannabis. Today we're going over the 7 main lessons I learned while working in the industry and my advice for entrepreneurs. So let's get started. Lesson 1. Profit margins can actually be quite surprisingly small if you don't know what you're doing. It's really only the gold rush for those who know what they're doing, have a plan, etc., etc. Indoor grows, because of the control, can garner a lot more profitability than outdoor growing. But there is a lot more to consider when you're talking about profitability. The main detraction would be everything surrounding electricity, the cost. So where you set up your grow is going to determine how much your baseline cost is for your kilowatt per hour, but then you also have to calculate what types of lights you're using, because that'll determine the wattage, how much it costs to run those lights, how much air conditioning you will need to counteract that heat. There's a lot that goes in that'll affect the profitability of your indoor growing. So with all those instances surrounding electricity, what has come from that to have a very quick determination of whether a grow is successful or not is a question that is asked is how many pounds per light did you yield? So if you've got a grow room that's got 20 lights, what did just one light produce? And then you can just extrapolate basically. But that is an easy way to compare different grows that are using different lights, different methods, different growing methodology. How many pounds per light did you yield? But obviously there's so much more that goes into that, including potency, a lot of other things that determine quality. But that is kind of a baseline thing that people in the industry use to determine whether you were successful or not. To add to that, to just your straight electricity, you still have the cost of the building, the upkeep of the building, the supplies to keep the building running, your staff, security depending on how big or what you're doing, the taxes that go along, the extreme taxes. And thus the shelf price is reflective of all those upfront and running costs. So outdoor doesn't cost as much, but it doesn't produce quite as high quality. But it takes a lot of inputs to create that indoor quality. So that is the first lesson, is profit margins, unless you know what you're doing, they're probably going to be pretty small and not what you would think for a cannabis gold rush. Lesson 2 has to do with scalability. So generally speaking, you have to do larger scale will help reach cannabis's full financial potential. So when I started out, it was a very small craft style business. We do very small batch production, and the profitability was quite low. The margin was quite low. As you scale up and as technology moves with the industry, because as I'll explain, prior to about the year 2000, all extraction was done on a very small scale, dangerous, probably illegal. There's very, very few, if any, permitted and licensed extraction facilities. And add to that, the actual equipment used was only available for very small scale, just a couple of pounds a day, maybe a little bit more than that. But now, 20 years later, now that the laws have allowed businesses to actually create full-scale extraction equipment, we've now gone from a couple pounds today to several 100,000 pounds per day. That obviously has changed the market drastically and has given a huge outlet for those large scale operations that prior to, a decade ago, most companies were throwing away trim or selling it for very, 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 very cheap for, people who baked edibles. But now we have hydrocarbon, CO2 extraction. It's a whole different ballgame for scalability and profitability. Lesson number 3 has to do with trimming, the trimming of the actual cannabis flower once it's done growing. So if you're unfamiliar, once the cannabis plant is done growing, it has the leaves that were used to suck up the moisture, the nutrients, get the light, etc. But those don't really have resin on them. Or some do. If it's a really, really top-notch quality grow, you'll see the little glandular resin on the plant. But for the most part, companies that are selling their cannabis flower just want the bud, none of the leaf. So you have to do a nice fine trim to get all that leaf off and just leave the very higher potency and higher quality product to go on the shelf. And all that trimmed off leafy stuff used to be thrown away, but is now used generally for extraction, whether for concentrates or an infused product or something like that. So with trimming, it's very time consuming. It can be very expensive if you're trying to do it correctly, which is why you'll see the use of mechanical trimming machines. In my opinion, look, the technology is always going to be changing and getting better. As of the end of October 2020, I have not personally come across any trimming machines that would meet my standards if I'm trying to put out top shelf product. It's not to say that they're getting better and better and closer to a hand trim quality, but for me, that is a good indication of whether a brand gives a shit. I understand that's a huge cut for profits, and it's not completely necessary if you can get a trimming machine to do a 90% job, 90% of what a hand trim can do. But, what are you trying to put out there as a brand? Because you're up against brands like Cannabis who don't even touch the bud or the flower whatsoever and still hand trim it. How are you going to compete with them, especially when their prices are coming down pretty low now? So just trimming in general is a tricky one. It's something you, as an entrepreneur, will need to figure out if you're dealing with flower, whether you can figure out a good hand trimming method that's not too costly, or whether you have to go the trim machine method. That's a tough one. That's a tough one. Lesson 4, investors really only care about the bottom line and definitive numbers. They're not really interested in putting out the highest quality product. So because they only work with definitive, like they'll ask you, okay, if we put in this much to buy this, what will we get on that first harvest? How much profitability? Well, okay, there's about 100 million things in between you investing your money and you getting your money back. Things that could go wrong, there's just so many different possibilities to affect the outcome that it's really hard to give definitive numbers. You have to give really kind of wide ranges to say, well, look, if everything goes right, which is, first go around is probably not going to happen. You got to get some cycles through before you get everything honed in. But if everything was to go right, here's potentially what could happen. But if these things happen, it could be down on this side. Investors I've found with the ones I've worked with, have a really hard time dealing with those flexible numbers. The thing is, if you don't have a perfectly controlled environment, things will go wrong. Things won't be perfect. Things will be a little offset, and that could affect your quarterly, month-to-month profitability. It could, one thing can throw a huge wrench in your entire operation. Just like, for instance, not having a sealed environment. Somebody from the outside world who doesn't, you don't have a proper SOP to make sure nothing gets in, it's very easy to contaminate your grow and ruin an entire crop. So you'll see a lot more companies following the New England Treatment Access. So here's a tour from YouTube where they have both a changing room, so you can put on sterilized clothing, and then you go into an air quarantining room, which knocks off any potential contaminant that you would be bringing into the grow. That's gonna, that'll be the standard. Right now it's above and beyond, but that'll be the standard eventually, because just control is such a huge part. Lesson 5 is the market can change in a heartbeat. I was so surprised to see how quickly every brand will do a complete 180-degree shift in what they're doing if a new product pops up in the market all of a sudden. So the first big thing that happened was concentrates. when extraction, the backyard hazardous extraction was happening, we started getting concentrated cannabis. So, we doubled, tripled, quadrupled the potency. And that was a huge shift, because not only did the potency go up and purity go up, but it also allowed that avenue discussed earlier of not wasting trim. So, we're talking sometimes half of your yield of all the plant would be to trim, which would normally be tossed. So you're saving half of your plant material, which isn't worth as much as your buds, but it's still worth a good amount if you know what to do with it. So when extraction came along, everybody took notice. You had to, you're throwing away trim. All of a sudden you don't need to throw it away, and it's worth money and can help your brand, et cetera, et cetera. That was a huge thing. So that changed a lot. But then we got into distillation. We started getting into vape pens. We started getting into more intricate edibles, transdermal patches, pills. The list keeps going on. And if you're not aware to what is happening and what is changing, and you just kind of go, well, we're going to do our thing, you may be missing out on a huge part of the market. And the most blatant example is simply the trim issue, the extracting trim. If you were throwing that away, and you were especially even medium to large scale, any scale, but the larger scale you go, if you're just trashing that trim or giving it away or going for really, really, really selling it for a really small amount, you're missing out on a huge portion of that extraction concentrate part of the market. So if you're not if you're not aware of real market moving products versus hype, you might start falling for things that are kind of a flash in the pan. But the market changes quick, and it behooves you to understand why, how, and whether you need to, as a brand, as a company, to follow along with that new trend. Lesson 6, probably the most important general basic lesson to be learned, is how important quality, knowledgeable growers are. They're the basis and foundation for every other product. You can't make a good edible without a good starting product, or at least, or that's a whole different story. But if you're just going flower to edible, if you got really low quality stuff, you're gonna have a lot of issues, not only with just potency, but if your grower doesn't know what they're doing and they got mold or they didn't flush right, that flavor, that issue is going to be transferred over to the next product, the synthesized or concentrated product. So a very knowledgeable grower not only will get you better product, but even more important, will help prevent those massive headaches that can come up that can lead to those big financial losses. So, growers can prevent these massive headaches. For instance, if mold breaks out, if lights go out for a certain amount of time and the cycle gets off, all those things, if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to be playing catch up. And a good, knowledgeable grower will save you so much headache and money, and probably make you more money than you expected. One of the easiest examples to look at is canopy growth up in Canada and their issue with irradiation, which is a whole topic for another video. Lesson 7, just like there are people who will happily drink lower quality beer or liquor, the same goes for cannabis. Just because your brand doesn't stand out or sucks in the eyes of a discerning drinker or cannabis user doesn't mean you can't be successful or generally enjoyed by the masses. There are already several cannabis brands that I would consider are filling that role, purposefully or not, but that is happening, and it doesn't mean that they're not going to be successful or enjoyed. So there you have it, the 7 main lessons I learned while trying to start up and work in the cannabis industry, and my advice for entrepreneurs looking to get started in your area. Please comment with any questions or any advice if you've worked in a cannabis industry somewhere as well, and I appreciate you watching. Thanks for joining. Bye.